It's interesting that on a day like this, we talk about change, right? We talk about how a person ends up meaning and having impact, and you have to recognize him for what he was and what he ends up meaning to people now. And that's the case with Cesar Luis Menotti, of course, who passed away at age 85. And it's incredible when you start looking back at his career that he ends up being that agent for change at 35. Of course, we have to go back 50 plus years, where, of course, a player that had, as a player at Rosario Central, ends up being very good, very, he had decent, good. He was very good. He wasn't great, but he was a very good player. Had a very good footballing mind, but also ends up being one that wants to experiment and bring forth his footballing idea. He wanted to bring it forth on the pitch as a player. He did at times. He could, but he had other plans. He had something else that was a bit more revolutionary at the time. And when we talk about revolutionary now, of course, sometimes revolutionary ends up becoming normal at a certain stage. And now many of the concepts that Menotti talked about, and of course using wide players, using one of those coaches that really emphasized wide play, one of those coaches that started looking at having more balance but also having more fluidity. And he was one of those that had a great idea in terms of what he wanted to do. But it wasn't necessarily that. He was one of those first coaches that truly started talking about relationships. And I'm talking about coach-player relationships, where he showed a level of empathy. And coaches weren't, it took a while, but he was one of those coaches that kind of was very philosophical, had a different view of the world instead of cracking the whip every time a player made a mistake. And looking for the positives in the player in order to accentuate things, in order to accentuate not only the collective, but in terms of having the player understand where they were and where they could go in terms of their strengths, but also knowing that, well, we also have to see how to compensate their weaknesses, if you will. And he did that very well. He did that masterfully. He was he was an important agent of change in terms of Argentine football, because, of course, many are probably recall, oh yeah, they won the World Cup in 2022, but you have to understand where they were from 1970. We'll use that. Well, 1966, and the campaign that they had in the World Cup in England. Then 4 years later, they end up being knocked out of the World Cup, or not even knocked out of the World Cup. They didn't qualify for the World Cup in 1970. They were knocked out by Peru in La Bombonera. And Argentine football was in disarray at the national team level. There were a lot of issues going on. There were a lot of there's a lot of mismanagement. The national team was going nowhere. The clubs were the ones that really ended up prospering the most. So much so that there always reigned a sense of the club over country type of issue. Although when the national team's doing well, that gap kind of diminishes. Although in some minds, the clubs are still over top the country. That's another issue. That's another conversation. That's another video. But for the most part, Menotti changes that paradigm and ends up changing that relationship between player-coach, ends up saying, hey, we need to organize our national team a lot better. There needs to be better planning. Because at times with the national team, it was just like, oh, let's just throw them together and see what happens. Yeah, we have the best players. And it happened in 1958, and it happened in 1950, and it happened a lot of times. Well, let's just throw whoever's there, let them get together and see what ends up coming out. Because they were successful in Copa America, Argentina, a lot of times. They thought that it would translate into win, and it really didn't. It did not. There was a different dynamic that had to be, and Menotti understood that. Of course, early on, it didn't work for him. Wins the tournament in 1973 with Huracan. To this day, one of the teams that's always greatest teams ever. When you talk to people, football historians, connoisseurs of Argentine football, they'll always mention Huracan 1973. Always. They will always mention that amongst the greatest teams of all time in Argentine football, because they were one of those teams that established a style of play. And Menotti was the architect of that. Takes over the national team, and keep in mind, like I said, there is a dynamic of well, Buenos Aires, and it's football being a reflection of society and being a reflection of history, where, of course, they want, you had the whole federalization versus porteñization, if you want to call it that, of football, where football was basically looked at from a wide and vast context as just Buenos Aires. It's just Boca, River, the big teams in Buenos Aires, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then there was the federalization, the outside of it, where Newell's and Rosario Central and all the other teams from the other provinces kind of got left aside. Menotti's the one that came and changed that facet. He was the one that changed the whole concept of, let's just look at Buenos Aires. He brought in players like Mario Kempes, who at that time was playing at Rosario Central. I'm talking about 1974. Of course, a couple of years later, he ends up going to Spain and playing for Valencia. You had all those players. Chancha La Rosa, a couple other names end up escaping me, but for the most part, you started to see the loosening of that grip within the Buenos Aires groups in power, and allowing the provinces and opening things to the provinces where all this talent started emerging and really becoming a hotbed of talent, if you will. And more inclusive the national team became. Some will say yes, some will say no. But if you start seeing how things were looking, he was looking for players all over the country instead of just looking within one little area, one little scope, one little group, one little territory, if you will. Changed it, more planification, more working collectively in terms of the relationship, not with him and the players now. I'm talking about the relationship within the players on the pitch and how they end up having to relate to one another and knowing how one another had to cover one another, pardon the redundancy. That ends up being key in terms of Argentina's growth and change in terms of a style of play. Yeah, it didn't work out in 1974. It was a disaster because that hadn't fully been consolidated yet. 1974 comes in. Of course, he takes over months before the World Cup. Doesn't work out as well, but okay, we have to continue this project. We have to continue with Menotti. Menotti continues. And of course, he has all this time to start developing and looking for players and looking and changing and interchanging pieces to give the national team a little bit more continuity. Keep in mind, this is during a time that Argentina is not successful in the Copa America. Peru wins the Copa America in 1975. Paraguay ends up winning it in 1979. So Argentina is not only struggling in a World Cup setting, they're also struggling to assert themselves. And of course, Brazil, post-Pelé, ends up kind of having a dip, although there were some important players that were still around, the Riverinos and Roberto Dinamite towards the end of the mid to 1970s. Brazil still had a bit of a significant downfall in terms of their style. But again, when I talk about Brazil, it has to be looked at in another context. Why? Because I'll mention in just a second. Just follow with me here on this video. Argentina ends up quickly establishing itself. There's lots of pushback from media there, although there's pushback on the media in terms of Menotti, but there wasn't pushback from the media in other things. Obviously, we have to keep in mind that the Argentine junta was already in power. So football was basically the one big criticism that could be made. Of course, politically, anyone that started criticizing the military dictatorship, that's already been well documented. So the World Cup comes along in 1978. He ends up, having some issues early on, a bit of a slow start. They lose to Italy. They end up going from Buenos Aires out to, Rosario to end up playing. And of course, they take the long way, how they call it, especially if you're the home team. You have to take the long way. Instead of playing all your matches at the Estadio Monumental, they have to go and play their way back to Buenos Aires, which they end up doing, and they end up winning against the Netherlands 3-1. Of course, that triumph consolidates Menotti as a brilliant coaching mind, and of course, he starts to establish his school of thought, which today ends up being so relevant because you look at what Menotti has done from that time on. He's looked at as an authority in terms of football. Obviously, you win a World Cup. Well, look at Lionel Scaloni nowadays. He's looked at as an authority. 2018, 2019, he was a nobody that's, well, discardable because he's just an interim coach. A little bit different with Menotti at that time, but when you look at what he was able to do, well, yeah, you know, it's important. It's relevant. 1978, maybe the only criticism to this day that Menotti has is that he didn't pick Maradona to be on the national team. Diego at that point was 18 years old. He thought that there needed to be a process. He thought that there needed. Many would disagree because if you're good enough, you're old enough. Well, he was definitely good enough, and he was definitely old enough, and maybe he was too old at that point. Maybe too, you could say comically. He could have played at 16. He could have played at 17. He had that type of talent. Menotti knew it. Menotti wasn't, too shy about it. He knew exactly what was going on. But Menotti understood. He knew his principles. And of course, he did stand up to the military dictatorship because he had a foot to stand on. Because he was the coach of the national team. And of course, later on, he got asserted even more. And Menotti ends up being, maybe not a voice, I shouldn't say that, but he did show certain amounts of disagreement with the Argentine government at the time. Now, did it make him a martyr? No, it didn't. But it just lets you know exactly where he stood in terms of his positioning. Was he too loud about it? No, he wasn't. He wasn't dumb. He understood what was going on, and he understood fully well. Win the World Cup, everything's fine. 1980 comes along, the Mundialitos played. Yeah, okay. Uruguay ends up winning it. It really does anyone no harm. Maradona ends up getting one of his first looks in friendlies. Of course, a year before that, he ends up being the absolute superstar in the 1979 Under-20 World Cup, which Menotti coaches. And there was really no other stop for him than to be part of the national team, which he ends up being in 1982. He ends up being, at that point, the big star, maybe in world football at that point, that many are looking at him as the next. And maybe sometimes even looked at as the president. Mind you, people forget that in 1982, 83, 84, Maradona's already being looked at as a flop, basically. Because Argentina get knocked out in the second round. He ends up getting sent off against Brazil. He goes to Barcelona. Everyone's expecting Barcelona to start winning league titles, winning, they win a Copa del Rey, they win a Spanish Super Cup. They do win that. They never win a league. And of course, they kind of were mired in a epoch in which Real Madrid, obviously, but it wasn't even Real Madrid. Real Madrid weren't the main team in the early 80s, going to 81 through 83, 84, if you want to. Domestically, I'm talking about. Real Madrid do get to the final of the UEFA Cup in 1984. It was Athletic Club and it was Real Sociedad during that time that were the two powerhouses. Real Madrid, Barcelona. There's basically a 4-team league. Maradona comes in and now it's Barcelona's turn. It doesn't end up working out that way because it's a different time and Spanish football wasn't what it is today, or Spanish football style of play wasn't what it is today or was over the past 10, 15 years. It's more, as the nickname, the moniker basically, Furia Roja, which is all grit and physicality and going. That's what Spanish football was at that time because the two teams that played it were exactly that. And the coach that led Athletic Club, Javier Clemente, was more about that. Grit and marking and mucking it up and being... So much so that Antonio Goicoechea, everyone remembers, in 1982, 83, thereabouts, ends up breaking Maradona's ankle in a Copa del Rey match. Of course, the year after that, the big fight that ensues. You see Maradona, you've seen it on social media all the time where Barcelona and Athletic Club were going after at it. That was basically Maradona's last match. Menotti was the coach back then. Maradona comes in. Menotti joins in. Of course, you have a splendid Barcelona side during that time. But they didn't fulfill expectations. Thus, Maradona was being looked at already in many circles as a flop. Menotti didn't have a great deal of success at Barcelona. Yes, he won trophy. Yeah, he won 3 trophies at Barcelona. But at Barcelona, it's not just winning about 3 trophies. It's which are the 3 trophies that he won and which are the 3 trophies that everyone expected them to win. So, yeah, there's moments that Menotti has that are down moments. There are moments that he had that are extremely high moments. But as his career wore on, it was more the influence that he was as a coach. He doesn't win anything else after that. He's coached. He goes and coaches in Mexico. He coaches a season in Uruguay. He coaches. Of course, Menotti coaches the Mexican national team for about two years in 1991, post World Cup. Keep in mind, Mexico didn't play in the 1990 World Cup, so it ends up being quite the interesting set of circumstances where his influence. He left the seed and it kind of planted going towards the future, I guess. Maybe not so much at Barcelona, because Barcelona throughout the coming years really wasn't too successful in the 80s. Yes, they do get to a European Cup final, but they lose to Steaua Bucharest very much later on in that decade. But it does start to sow the seeds for, or at least kind of keep the seeds in waiting for what ends up being Johan Cruyff when he arrives later on in the decade, creates the dream team at that point, keeps at least the idea alive, if you will. But you look at many, Guardiola has talked about him, Bielsa's talked about him at certain points, and that's where the idea of Menottismo comes in. But overall, Menotti and his school of thought ended up being the school of thought. Then, of course, we switch from Menotti and going to the other end, because we can't talk about one without talking about the other. El Flaco was very influenced with what Bilardo was able to do when he took over the national team from 84, 85 going into the World Cup. Of course, he had his troubles during the World Cup, almost doesn't even qualify if it weren't for Ricardo Gareca pushing that ball forward and allowing Argentina to get in that playoff. And then the other school of thought emerges. Why? Because Argentina wins the 1986 World Cup. Bilardo has his mind set. Now, it's not only the whole Bilardista, Menottista argument isn't just in terms of how they put their chips on the table. It's what they believe, how they believe. You know, you go from a Menotti that ends up being very lyrical and very poetic and very romantic and very philosophical to Bilardo, who obviously a man that not only was a footballer, just like Menotti, but he was a hard man. He was one that comes in and would knock you down and try and break your legs. Menotti wasn't that. Menotti was more of a freestyling, let's move that ball around, let's try and have some movement, more finesse. Bilardo wasn't that. But not only wasn't Bilardo that, Bilardo was also a doctor. Bilardo understood pragmatism. Bilardo absorbed and lived and died by pragmatism, but also trying to find little things that you can get into someone's head to make a difference. Whether it's pinching them, whether it's finding out the habits of their wives, where their wives end up frequenting, or where their sister ends up going, and where anything you can fill in the blank. Basically, that was fair game for Bilardo. Oh, by the way, keep in mind that this guy, I don't know. So you go and you whisper in his ear, hey, I know this. That type of thing. That's how Bilardo was. Of course, to this day, people in Brazil talk about Branco and the water bottle, right? Well, Bilardo doesn't deny it. He doesn't admit it. But something along those lines that you end up having that bit of suspicion. Nowadays, when Bilardo was a bit more lucid, to not say it in another way, and he's not, he was still doing interviews, he would say, hey, I regret that type of attitude, because with Menotti, it's how the team played, how the team executed, how the team did this, how the team did that. And with Bilardo, it was all about winning and winning at all costs, because if you didn't win, you were a loser. Because if you didn't win, nobody was going to remember you. You weren't you weren't the one that people are going to remember. You weren't the one that's going to go down in history as this. And that ends up being kind of a harsh way to look at things, because it ends up being poetic, because Bilardo wins the World Cup in 1986, still coaches the national team. They get to the final in 1990, and they lose. But many still remember that Argentina side from 1990, not for not winning. People don't forget the 1990 side. They still remember that 1990 side for what they had to go through and endure, and for what Diego had to endure, not only from a personal standpoint of the ankle injury that he was basically hopping on one leg the entire tournament, but also what was going on with him in Italy and what ended up ensuing in Italy that ends up meaning the end of his time at Napoli. It wasn't just, if you look at documentaries and things, it wasn't just his own personal demons. It was everything that was surrounding him, especially after that match against Italy. And of course, the final against Germany. So you have one school of thought, and it's always been that. Oh, the only thing that matters is winning. No, what matters is also the style. That argument. At times, it rarely dealt with how, and where these two coaches used their players on the pitch. It ends up being a philosophical conversation about what these two coaches were always striving to do in terms of their philosophy, not necessarily their tactics or their tactical disposition. Menotti, of course, coaches at the Mexican national team, I mentioned, an era where there was Garcia Aspe, Carlos Hermosillo. I think Sage was still part of the national team. Someone on the comments can correct me if I'm wrong. Somewhere around those lines. Jorge Campos, a young Jorge Campos, was now the goalkeeper for the Mexican national team. Only last 2 years. Still were able to qualify to the 1994 World Cup. And it was very sporadic for Menotti. Yeah, I mentioned Uruguay. At a certain point, he coaches Boca after they win the league title. It was in 1993. Then, of course, a couple of years later, he coaches Independiente. Still, of course, he coaches Independiente yet another time in the future. But at that point, Menotti as a coach still was more the presence of Menotti. And it wasn't the success of Menotti. Although, like I said before, he would either take over in times where teams are on the way down, or he would take over in times when they're coming up. And then when he leaves, that's when they end up hitting one of their big successful moments. Independiente was the case because he leaves, and then, of course, they ended up winning the Argentine Super Cup. Menotti just ends up being a very unique individual, and that's what made him such a special man. And, of course, one ended up having quasi-personal moments, because when I was living in Buenos Aires, there was a moment where I was teaching English over on the street's called Paraguay, and the office where I was teaching English happened to be on the third floor. And every morning, in the break room, or we'd all be sitting down drinking coffee, we'd get up and look out the window, drinking coffee. On the other side was Cesar Luis Menotti, and every day we'd go and wave hi to him, and he'd wave hi back. You would cross him on the street, he would say hello. Obviously, I never had the courage to go and speak up and talk to him. That was before I really started getting into this business. But you'd see him at a cafe sitting outside, and you say, "Hey, prof, Maestro, how are you? How are you doing?" You just walk on by. And you talk to many former players of Menotti, and they all praise him for what he was and for what he meant to their lives. And I think that, more than any World Cup, ends up being the most important aspect of it. So much so that many former Argentine national team players, one in particular, Lionel Scaloni, credited a lot of his influence on a man that had a lot to do with it. And it was Menotti, who at that point, at this stage, until recently, he was his advisor, if you will. He was the sporting director of the Argentine national team into his mid-80s. So, if there's anything to say about his legacy, is that we can't say we're going to forget about him, because many of the words that we evoke, many of the concepts that we think about, many of the plays that are seen, and many of the philosophies that are thrown back and forth all have him in it. That, in and of itself, ends up being the most important and deepest form of gratitude that one can have, is to keep that conversation alive. and to keep that facet of one's life alive, because he made it more human, but yet he made it more poetic, and he made it more romantic, and he made it more accessible. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is probably one of the biggest gifts that you could ever get from a person like that, because he truly made things where, even though we don't know it, even though we don't think it, we always have his words in mind. And that can never make a person like him leave. And that can never make someone leave the collective conscience of a footballing community, for any community. Talk to you soon.